Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Larry Burmeister. I'm a professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Wealth and Poverty Immigration Week series. And one of the really great things about our next speaker is that he comes from outside of the College of Arts and Sciences. These themes, like the wealth and poverty theme, were developed in the College of Arts and Sciences, but I think there was always the hope that faculty from other colleges would become interested in these themes and would become participants. So that has certainly happened in this case. So I would like to give a brief introduction for Professor Felipe Aros-Vera, who is a member of the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering in the Russ College of Engineering. And Professor Aros-Vera got his Ph.D. pretty recently in 2014 from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, a very high-quality science and technology university in upstate New York. And Professor Aros-Vera is also an immigrant, recent immigrant to the U.S.
Yep.
And, you know, in all of our demonization, recent demonization of the immigrant stream into the U.S., we forget about how crucial recent immigrants are to our science and technology base. And I think Professor Aros-Vera is a good illustration of the major contributions that immigrants are making, you know, in our society today. Professor Aros-Vera has kind of a very interesting research trajectory. He is using a lot of the tools in his profession to analyze how humanitarian crises can be managed. And I found that a quite interesting element of his research portfolio. One of the descriptors of his research interest is humanitarian logistics, how things that are needed to deal with humanitarian crises get distributed. And it's quite a difficult problem, I think. And he's also done a lot of other kind of interesting work. One of the most interesting projects he had was to do some kind of analysis of the park and ride system in New York City. I thought that was, you know, it was quite an interesting practical application of the kind of research tools that he is using in his research. And I guess today's talk is going to try to apply basically supply chain models and kind of network analysis models to his topic, Understanding and Crippling Human Trafficking Networks. And before I turn it over to Professor Aros-Vera, I want to give one more kind of editorial comment. I always like to encourage students to think about how their own topical interests kind of cross over into other areas. So I teach demography. In demography, we talk, you know, migration is one of the three cores of population dynamics. And this question is very related to the sociology, criminology topical interests, I would argue, of many of our majors. Here we're talking about how criminal enterprises are organizing migration streams to exploit people who, you know, are in very precarious positions, either economically or living in conflict zones where their lives are in danger. So from a sociology, criminology standpoint, this kind of migration topic is really kind of a very interesting question. So I'll turn it over to Professor Aros-Vera.
Well, thank you very much for a wonderful introduction. I actually didn't remember some of the projects that I worked. The Park and Ride one was one of the first ones I worked in when I came to the United States, and I Also, just remember, I'm an immigrant, by the way. I just realized that. Well, anyways, well, thank you very much for coming today to this presentation. As Professor said, I come from industrial and systems engineering, where we use operations research tools, mathematical modeling, in order to tackle complex systems, to try to solve different problems, right? In that context, I've been working on humanitarian logistics, as you said. As part of my work as well, I go to disasters, right? So I talk to disaster responders, humanitarians. I went to Nepal. I was after Hurricane Sandy, spent some time in Ecuador, and most recently I went to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And one of the big problems with disasters is that they create a lot of vulnerabilities, right? There was a very interesting article arguing about the increase of human trafficking after the 2015 earthquake in Nepal, for example, right? Now, the reason why I got involved in fighting human trafficking is because about a year ago, my wife, actually, she organized a workshop here in Athens about human trafficking. And Tonya Falks, who is the liaison for the human trafficking liaison for the Montgomery County in the Dayton area, she came to Uptown and she gave a workshop about human trafficking. And even though at the time my wife organized the workshop, so I was watching my little monkey, and she was all over the place, so I couldn't really see the entire presentation. But the parts I saw and the stories I heard and kind of the dimension of the problem really was an eye-opening experience for me. So even though I didn't see the entire presentation, I felt this big need to actually try to do something about it, right? From my own discipline, from my own work, try to tackle this problem and try to contribute a little bit on fighting human trafficking. Okay? So before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge students who have been collaborating, and they have been instrumental in the work of this research, right? So Catherine she's a Ph.D. student working specifically in human trafficking, in fighting human trafficking. Cesar Carrillo, who is in the audience today, he's an undergrad student, soon to graduate, so we're going to miss him after this semester. And then Kemi Jones and Alana Wesley, they graduated, they're ISC alumni, and they did probably the first formal project on human trafficking in my class of supply chain engineering. So, human trafficking is a very sensitive topic. And I have to admit that every time I present, or when I'm writing actually, I have a hard time articulating my ideas around technical terminology when I know people are involved. It's a really, really hard exercise, right? And in fact, I was writing a paper or a proposal, and I sent it to a professional editor who works with me. And I said, you know what? I'm having a hard time to find the language to compel my ideas in this topic. And she replied back, and she was like, you're right, me too. I'm also finding it's a difficult topic. So I just wanted to say that the technical terminology that we're using to refer to people, actually, right? So either criminals or victims, in the context of this research and this presentation, does not seek to further diminish human dignity, okay? Quite the opposite. We're trying to use engineering terminology and tools to identify, characterize, model, fight, and cripple these illicit networks, right? So the central goal of this work is to hopefully free people and save lives. That is the fundamental. I wanted to apologize in advance because I do understand that it's a sensitive topic. So just a brief overview of this presentation. So it's about understanding human trafficking and seeing how we can cripple these networks, right? So there's a couple of assumptions there that I'm going to try to address with these 4 questions. First, we're going to define what is human trafficking from a US law perspective. Then we're going to define and try to get a common language in terms of what is a network or what are networks in general, right? And why we can use them to model and try to fight human trafficking supply chains or human trafficking networks, right? And then once we do this twofold exercise, we're going to dive into the questions of, well, once we know what is human trafficking and what are networks, can we use networks to understand human trafficking supply chains? And even more important, can we use some tools that we have in network theory in order to destroy these networks? So that's the overall of the presentation. So what is human trafficking? Anybody want to say something? Does anybody have an idea? It's not Cesar because he knows about the topic. But anybody wants to?
I can try. So to me, understand it is the transfer or the harboring or transporting of a human being for the purposes of exploiting.
Yep. That's a very good definition from a supply chain perspective. It's a very accurate one, right? Now, US law defines human trafficking as the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into either commercial sex, labor, or services against his or her will, right? There is one fundamental distinction, and to kind of be clear about it, is that there's one exception with minors and commercial sex, right? So inducing a minor into commercial sex is considered human trafficking regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. Why defining or understanding the definition from the law, from the legal perspective is important? Because one of the biggest difficulties that we have nowadays is the prosecution of human trafficking cases, okay? So the more I talk to experts in the field, lawyers and people involved in prosecuting human trafficking cases, they say that the amount of evidence and how we can prove the use of one of these 3 components is rather difficult. So that imposes another layer of difficulty because it's not only about identifying these individuals, right, both criminals and victims, and then going to the process, but actually proving. The prosecution process in some cases can be even more difficult than prominent cases like manslaughter and things like that. It can be very difficult. So, what is this? What is this? Where in the back I stay? There's water, right? Exactly. Well, that's Michigan. My wife is from Michigan, by the way. So, this is Michigan. What county is this? Anybody? Well, Detroit, right? But Wayne County. Okay, that's Wayne County. Wayne County, Michigan. And the reason why I'm showing this picture is because last year, October 2018, 123 missing children were found in Michigan, in Wayne County, during a sex trafficking operation. 123. That's a big number. Those are children that were being trafficked, that were trafficked. Not too far from here in Dayton, this is another case. So there was a company of roofing and siding that was paying human traffickers to bring migrants. This was in 2013, I believe. Migrant workers. And then he was bringing with traffickers to Dayton, and then they were underpaid working in his company. So the first one is an example of sex trafficking. This one is an example of labor trafficking that I'm hoping that you can see it's not in a different country, somewhere around the world. It's not down in South America, close to my home country in Chile. No, it's here in Michigan, in Ohio, West Virginia, so on and so forth, right? So it's a problem that we have today, and we need to find the tools to fight. These are just some numbers of human trafficking reports, right? So these are big numbers, if you ask me, 7,000, 8,000 reports of human trafficking. Of course, somebody can say, well, these are reports. It doesn't mean that there was a prosecution, right? Well, these are the numbers of the actual prosecutions. So this plot is from Polaris project. That I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later when we address the awareness of human trafficking in the United States. Okay? And this one is from humantraffickingdata.org. This data has been collected, it's actually collected even today, by Professor Vanessa Boucher from Texas Christian University. She got a grant from the Department of Justice, and she's been collecting this data since 2000 with thousands of cases of human trafficking in the United States, right? Either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, anything related to human trafficking, right? I mentioned this because Dr. Boucher and my research group started a collaboration not too long ago. So hopefully we can, and she's from political science, by the way. She's been collecting this data since a long time, and when we started working on this, one of the first challenges that we found was the lack of data, lack of information. It's something that I'm also going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation, right? So how is the human trafficking operation? Well, we all know it's illegal, right? It's a form of modern slavery, but it's also a multi-million-dollar industry, and that's the main driver, right? Money. It is estimated that today we have more than 40 million people under slavery conditions in the world, right? The majority of those are under labor trafficking, although sex trafficking in general is more prominent because it's more mediatic and it appears more in the news, right? In essence, what they do is they advertise services, they transport these individuals, collect, and the cycle continues, right? So this is kind of a simplified way or a simplified approach that we've been taking so far to understand human trafficking, right? So in this presentation, what we want to do is to invite you to look at it with a little bit of a more holistic perspective and try to understand the patterns of human trafficking. So this is data from the Polaris project. In essence, there is a human trafficking hotline that you can call and you can report some situations, right? Situations like what? Good friend of mine, a professor at the DePaul University in Chicago, he was very cold last week. He was in Europe, traveling between countries. And he said this was like some years ago, so he didn't really pay attention to the situation. But he said that before boarding, when he was waiting at the gate, he said that 3 people came, 1 man and 2 women. And when the time came to board, the man was in charge of the 3 passports. That's a red flag right there. That's a red flag, because one of the things that traffickers do right away is to take possession of their identifications, and they are not allowed to leave their countries or to move around freely. So that was a red flag, right? At the time, he didn't know it. But now he's also working in human trafficking. He's from the College of Business in DePaul University. And he's come to realize all these situations that we need to be aware of. So there is an increased awareness in social media. I was in the Bureau of Motor Vehicle a couple of days ago, and there was a sign actually about human trafficking. There is a human trafficking task force that 2 weeks ago came to campus. we organized that session. And they talk about all the challenges of human trafficking in Ohio specifically. So thankfully, we're getting more traction, we're getting more awareness, and hopefully we can find the ways to fight this form of modern day slavery. But what is missing? And that's one of the key questions here, right? So when we started working on this topic, of course, we started with the idealistic approach of, well, we have all these fancy models, we're gonna, mathematical models, optimization models, so we're gonna take them and apply to the network of traffickers, and we're gonna find who's the bad guy, we're gonna put it to jail, problem solved, right? That was our hope. That was actually our first approach. Well, life doesn't work that way, right? There is a lot of missing pieces, and that's the tricky part, right? There's a lot of missing information. There is a lot of miscommunication and lack of collaboration between agencies. One of the questions that I asked to the Maria Bush, she's from the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, is if you can have your dream project, something that will help you fight human trafficking, what would that be? And her answer was actually pretty simple. She said, what if we are able, between agencies, to have a standard for communication and reporting? That was all. She just wanted to have a common language. And that shows the lack of coordination to some extent, because every county is required to report these situations, right? Every judge is required to report the situation. Every lawyer is required to report the situations. But everyone is talking a different language. And of course, that makes it difficult for people like us to take that information and put all the pieces together, right? So what I'm saying is, like, there is a lack of collaboration and standardization, right? So the names, dates, locations, where these cases happen, the frequency, right? Whether a person is being prosecuted once or twice or 3 times because of the same kind of crime, so on and so forth. Follow-ups, type, evidence. It's a very important component because, unfortunately, as I said before, the prosecution of human trafficking cases can be very, very difficult. Making the case against a criminal can be extremely difficult for many reasons. Contacts, phones, reports, age, finance. That's another thing that we were guessing. I mean, in general, follow the money and you're going to find the crime, right? It's like drug trafficking. Follow the money. And you're going to be able to fight these people, right? In the case of human trafficking, this is a little bit more difficult than that. The approach has been so far to train social workers, people working in medicine as well, to recognize, to identify the signs of human trafficking, right? So essentially, we're trying to fight the external nodes, to fight the people who are committing the crime all over the place, right? So that's been the approach. Now, many times, that approach does not end up in prosecution and indictment. Many times, we don't have enough evidence. Even worse, many times, the victim is considered the criminal. So a lot of, many of the victims of, for example, prostitution, before our system realizes that they are victims of human trafficking, they have 10, 15, 20 charges for prostitution because they still are in the system. It's a very difficult problem to solve. So now that we have a little bit of a good idea about human trafficking, what it is, how it's defined, and the challenges that we face when we try to fight human trafficking, let's talk about networks. What is a network? Anybody know? Or does anybody want to guess what is a network? That's an easy one. Come on, guys. Anybody? Yes, no, maybe? No? That was going to be the quiz of my class for my students here. No? Okay, well, I just took like a normal definition from computer science, right? So a computer network is a collection of computing devices that are connected in various ways in order to communicate and share resources, right? Well, pretty boring, right? Computer networks. So what? Well, let's forget about computers. Let's talk about networks. A network is a collection of computer devices, individuals, companies, infrastructure, intersections, you name it, anything that are connected in various ways in order to communicate and share resources, right? So your cell phone, when you connect to, I say Facebook, and people know I'm pretty old because nowadays it's a different social media, right? But Facebook is essentially a network between people. When you friend somebody, you create a link so you can access their profile, right? So there is a communication, there's a sharing of information, right? Have you heard of smart cities? Smart cities, it's a holistic approach to understand our cities and how they can share resources and communicate to each other. Driverless cars, they require communication with the infrastructure, with the streets. In fact, for years we've had communication between buses and the lighting system. So the lights, we can coordinate and make it more expedite for buses. So everything, all that is a network that are connected in different ways, right? Every time you have some kind of relationship between two people, two pieces of infrastructure, two computers, two cell phones, whatever, for communicating and sharing resources, then you're going to have a network, right? So it's computer to cell phone, anything like that. So all those are types of networks. Human brain is also a network, right? Every neuron is going to be a node, and the connection, I didn't do well in biology. How do you call the connection between two neurons? I don't remember. It was like, there was a name for that. Nobody in biology in this? Who's in biology? They're not going to raise their hands because they're anyways, the connection between neurons or brain cells, you know, the synapses that is produced to communicate chemicals, that's also a network, right? This is a network of a mouse, by the way. Probably have more connections than mine. But supply chains, those are also networks, right? So in supply chain, and this is, we're kind of progressing towards the field in which I work. In supply chains, we go from raw materials to the supplier, to the manufacturing, to the distribution system, customers, and final consumer, right? So there is a set of nodes, right, or steps. So everything you have, you know, who has a phone in this room? Who does not have a phone in this room, right? A phone, you didn't build your phone, right? So it came from a supply chain, actually, from many places, because suppliers take care of different components of your phone. Somebody will build the screen, another one the processor, another one the keyboard, and so on and so forth, right? So that is a traditional supply chain, right? In the case of human trafficking, there is a similar process. This is a simplified version of what we are going to discuss a little bit more in detail later on of the operation of human trafficking. But in essence, we have a relationship. There are similarities between the two processes, right? In one case, you are bringing raw materials and then manufacturing, going through all the echelons of the supply chain for the final consumer. And many supply chains nowadays, they're closed loop because they want to do either recycling or remanufacturing, so on and so forth. In the case of, and here's why I apologize at the beginning, in the case of human trafficking, there is a similar process. There is a process to abduct, attract resources, take them, advertise them, move them for the service, right? Collect the money, and go back to start again. Again, that's why I apologize at the beginning of the presentation, because the unfortunate product in this supply chain is a person. That's the reality. That's the reality. So, once we know what is a network, we know what is a supply chain, can networks help us understand human trafficking, right? And this was probably the fundamental question. And even though I'm passionate about networks and network science, and of course my answer wanted to be yes right away, we had to reflect a little bit and try to create a framework that can describe a human trafficking supply chain in terms of a traditional supply chain, or at least a network in the more traditional approach, right? So I apologize if you cannot see it in the back, but in essence, we're describing how the process works for the human trafficking operation. To make it easier, let's split it into 3 different sections, right? Predatory behavior, trafficking, and prosecution. So the predatory behavior, or the first approach, is when the criminals, the traffickers, right, find a way to abduct or try to attract people, right? This can be, by the way, it can be men, women, children, I mean, you name it. Everyone is vulnerable for this situation. Talking about vulnerabilities, right? As I said at the beginning of my presentation, one of the vulnerabilities can be poverty, for example. Disasters create some of these conditions. Drug addiction also create some of these conditions. So traffickers take advantage of this situation of vulnerable people, and they pull them into the system. So that is the first part of this diagram. The second one is the actual trafficking process, right? Where you have the victims and the exploiters, and then you have the fake businesses that they are in our cities, in our counties, everywhere in the United States, right? And you also have what in the human trafficking jargon we denominate the Johns. The Johns are the clients, essentially, which is also, by the way, illegal. And you can be prosecuted for buying sex. In the same process, well, we have in parallel, we have the enforcement agencies trying to work as well, right? Reporting hotlines, police departments, enforcement agencies, so on and so forth. At the end of the process, right, if we're able to find evidence, we go to the prosecution stage, in which we have the judicial system that is either able or unable to prove the case against one of these criminals and send him to jail, send her to jail. So that's the overall perspective of human trafficking. So can we use networks to understand this process, right? And the answer was yes, I think. First, out of recognizing the relevant links in the process and the relationships and how they transport the victims, we can use that information to fit it into a network design framework, right? First, we need to extract key actors in human trafficking: criminals, victims, clients, locations, victim flows. Victim flow refers to the transportation of these victims, of the individuals, which in many cases, is somebody who is external to the system. Of course, that's a strategy, because if the person doesn't know that he is participating in a human trafficking activity, it's essentially blind to the process and he cannot report it. But he is part of the same network as well. Transportation routes and modes, as I mentioned before, it can be, you know, the taxi driver, or it can be the airline that is transporting people between cities in Europe, for example. Then, how can we visualize the human trafficking? So we can take this information and put it into a format of a supply chain and find these nodes, find the relationship, and try to identify how the victims are being moved throughout the supply chain. Then we want to quantify, right? And this goes back to network theory in terms of the attributes of the network, right? How many people are, what's the flow, the nodes, what is the important guy? Because here's one of the fundamental things. If we compare human trafficking supply chains to drug trafficking, right, it is very difficult to catch El Chapo, right? Actually, the guy was a genius from a civil engineering perspective. The guy built a tunnel, and the tunnel had a motorcycle, so he escaped. He was genius. It's extremely difficult to find the big guy, right? Now, finding the drug seller on the street, it's relatively easy, right? Probably police enforcement already know who those individuals are. But what is the impact of putting one of these guys on the streets, putting them away, putting them into jail? What's going to happen? There's going to be another one. Somebody will take over, right? You watch Breaking Bad? There you go. Great show, by the way. I was shocked. Very good. But that's what happens. What I'm trying to say is the following. There is a guy, El Chapo, who if we find it and we're able to put him away, you're going to create a lot of damage to the network, right? There's a lot of confusion in wherever is the drug organization. Getting the small guy is going to do nothing to the network. What is the sweet spot? There must be somewhere in between those two individuals that if you attacked that guy, if you find that warehouse, if you are able to find the port in which they're bringing the drug, you're going to create a lot of damage to the network. Our hypothesis is that we can do something similar with human trafficking networks. It's hard to find the leader. It's very easy, unfortunately, to find the victims, you know, even some of the pimps. But many times, it's going to sound horrible, many times it's better, it's more efficient from an engineering perspective to leave these guys alone so we can find the trace and find the place in which we can create a big disruption in that network. And that is the challenge, right? That is the difficulty. So that's why network attributes are so important. Because network attributes refer to the most important node in the network, the critical link in the network. So there might be a couple links, a couple nodes, that if we kill them, well, not the guy, but if we destroy the node, we create the largest damage in the network. That is the fundamental insight. And then, of course, we can analyze the network properties and try to understand, you know, how they're operating, right? How the flows are going in and out, and finally finding this guy that we might denominate the hub, right? A hub is a term that comes from the airline industry, right? So if you travel abroad, you're more likely to go through either JFK in New York City, or Atlanta, or Miami, so on and so forth, right? Why? Because those are hubs. There's a lot of flights going into that place, and then people go into larger planes to other places, right? That's a hub. It's a place where a lot of flows go through, right? What if we're able to find that hub in human trafficking? Well, that would be a great contribution, because we can reconstruct and forecast what they're going to be doing. We can anticipate what the human trafficking network will do. That's the goal. That's something that we are hoping that we can do. So, final question. Can we cripple them? Can we destroy them? Can we actually use these things, or it's just a lot of philosophy, right? It's a work in process, work in progress, I must say, right? And one of the fundamental steps that we need to take, and we are taking, is to collaborate with enforcement agencies, right? With the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force, with lawyers working on this, and so on and so forth, right? So that's very important to have, from my perspective, practical implications, right? So in a traditional supply chain, this is how it works, right? There's a lot of relationships, as I mentioned before. We want to find the link, the manufacturer, the distributor, the retailer, where we can create the most damage to the supply chain. That is the fundamental insight, right? So here comes a concept of network interdiction models. Interdiction is a high impact disruption. It's exactly what I was referring before, right? So we do have, in engineering, mathematical models that find the critical link, the critical node in a network. In this network, interdiction models, or reinforcement models, the opposite, are used to reinforce the network, right? So to avoid having disruptions that will cascade and create a lot of damage to the network, right? So when we have a blackout, like in 2003, I think in the northeast part of the United States, or in Italy in 2007, I believe, I cannot fully remember, what happened in Italy is that there were interconnections between the systems. So there was a computer control system that failed. That affected one of the substations. Well, guess what? The substation was connected to another control station, and that one was connected to another. So the entire beautiful country of Italy was without power, right? In traditional engineering, we try to avoid that. Well, we are trying to do that, actually, because we want to create a blackout for these guys. That's essentially what we're trying to do. So we need to understand the hidden structure of human trafficking supply chains. What are the indicators, the indexes, and the patterns, how they move people around? That's a key question, right? And then we use models with either standard framework with key metrics, right? We have a phrase in engineering, what gets measured can be improved, right? And a good friend of mine, he's a Ph.D. in philosophy. He told me about, you can improve something that you don't need to measure. And I was like, yeah, I guess you're right. Yes, he's right. We have great conversations with him, by the way, but he has a different perspective. If we are able to create metrics that can extract that information, right, and then we can actually quantify the impact that we have when fighting human trafficking networks, right? And then we were able to enable change. In general, current models, and that's the next challenge in the work in progress that we have, are overly simplistic, right? The models nowadays in the literature of network interdiction models, they make several assumptions that do not apply. One is there are few factors affecting the network. Another one is that we know the operation, and this is one of the challenges in human trafficking networks. To apply a model, you need to apply a network interdiction model, you need a network. In the case of human trafficking, we know pieces of the information. We don't have the complete network. And of course, they're not going to tell us how the network is, right? So essentially, it's a two-step process. We need to first find those patterns and those signs that can help us build the network for then apply network interdiction models to the network that we just construct. And these are other of the assumptions of the simplistic methods nowadays, not time sensitive. So there's a lot of lack of insight in the network interdiction models that we have developed in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. They do not directly apply to the case of human trafficking networks. So the next generation of models, they need to assume, they need to incorporate several factors into the equations, right? They need to understand that there is low visibility and maybe partial information. We don't have complete information of the network. So we need to understand that. Multi-network, multi-echelon, strategic alignment, not time sensitive, so on and so forth. We need to incorporate those things into the modeling, right? In essence, what we need to do is to recognize complexity, right? As I said before, that which is measured can be improved, right? And that's our hope. So we want to account for network interactions, complexities, complex decisions, so on and so forth. And this slide is an actual, these are two cases of human trafficking that we took from the indictment reports, and we convert those reports that are like, I don't know, is Catherine in the room? No, it's not. She's, it's like 20 or 30 pages. Lawyers love, they love to write a lot. I don't know why, but there's a lot of information in it, right? Well, we were able to identify the information and put that all into a network format. So we know this guy right here are the pimps, the supply. There is a leader in the system. We were able to recognize a pattern in this network from the indictment report. These are the transportation modes, and in general, in this case, mostly the demand was at brothels. So these two networks come actually from indictment reports. And this is great news, because before doing this, we didn't have reliable information for this. And every time I went to either conferences or presentations from colleagues, everyone was like, we don't have data to apply these models, right? We've been working on these models, but there's like just a bunch of assumptions. We don't have this data. Well, guess what? We started digging, and we ended up collaborating with Dr. Vanessa Boucher from Texas Christian University. And we actually, she was very nice, and she actually gave us all the information from 2000. So this is work in progress. This is something that we're doing today, right? So once we have the network, we can do exactly this. So these are temporal screenshots of the network. If we create, so in every time the model is making a decision regarding how to allocate resources so that we can decrease the flow in the network. Remember, the flow is a person, right? So if the mathematical model tells us 250, those are 250 individuals that are traveling through the network in every time. So these 4 different lines assume different partial information of the network. Of course, if we have complete information of the network, in 7 iterations, 7 decisions that we can make, we can destroy the entire network and free everyone. If we only know information about the brothels, if we identify those, we can make decisions in the network, allocate it. And when I say make decisions, we can send policemen, send crews, identify the flows of money, and so on and so forth. Everything, all that is modeled into the optimization model, right? And after certain iterations, we can destroy the network as well. So as I said before, and by the way, these are 4 different cases, right? So if we know that, if we can identify the pimps, right, the blue one, we can also target them so that we can destroy the network. But as you can see, just knowing who are the pimps actually takes longer to destroy the network, right? So it's more useful to know the places where the crime is being committed than the guys on the streets. Things like that is what these network interdiction models can shed light on this subject. So, some final thoughts. The first one is we're just scratching the surface on the topic. I wish we had a tool. My dream is that we can create reports to enforcement agencies where it says how we can allocate, where they should focus, where in Dayton they should go, when, right? And who they should target in order to create the largest damage in the network. But we're just beginning. We're just understanding how these networks work. So it's just the first step. Awareness is the first and very important step, right? It's a very important step, and I'm very happy to see that across the board there's a lot of information out there now by the Polaris project, by the Human Trafficking Hotline, and so on and so forth. So I'm very glad that we have more information about this topic, right? But the next step, from my perspective, is that we need to measure this problem and to find the ways to cripple them, to find the way to fight human trafficking, right? And this, at different levels, the See Something, Say Something, that it was very popular, at least in New York City, when I used to live 3 hours from the city, it's very important as well. I mean, I don't want to say we're all part of the problem, because I don't think it's true, but we all can be part of the solution. If we're able to identify the situation, I don't want you to get in trouble, I don't want you to expose yourself, but there should be means to report this situation and be able to contribute to free people and save lives. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sure Professor Aros-Vera will be willing to take questions.
Yeah, of course.
Please.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Frona in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts, and I teach a class called Global and Transnational Theories. And I've started thinking that I should teach nefarious connections of global and transnational theories as well. So thank you for this talk. I was thinking about the networks that you painted for us, and then the lack of the network in the government agencies in terms of having the common language. And I was thinking about that disconnect, and also wondering if you have a sense of why these networks occupy our media imagination, where films and TV shows are occupied with these issues in such a huge way. And my other question is it useful to have gender, the implications of gender, be a part of the node? Because I'm assuming the trafficking is largely conducted by people who identify as male, and then the law enforcement is also largely, people who are male, but then the victims are largely female, and if gender plays a role at all in that. Thank you.
Okay. So two questions, right? The first one is about the networks that we have and don't have at the government level, and
then, why it's so prevalent in our popular imagination, but yet not in the legal frameworks.
Okay. I wish I had a strong answer to that. I'm going to guess a couple of things that it's mostly what I've gathered from some other individuals working on the. So all these networks that, well, first of all, at the government level, what I've heard is that there might be networks and information, but the problem is the links. So the communication that we have, right, between one node and the next one, or let's say this was the actual problem, but the Ohio Human Trafficking Task Force mentioned, the reporting language is different, right? So the way this county reports the human trafficking crime is this, and there is a different language on a different county. So they need to essentially sit and find the common language first to try to consolidate that information. Do you follow? Does that answer your question? So I think there are networks that we can take advantage of. It's just we haven't developed them in a way that we can use them to fight human trafficking. It's like the same problem that, to some extent, Vanessa Buche had. She has been collecting all this data for 19 years. But she didn't think, when she started collecting the data, that she could put this data in a network format and understand the problem as a network design problem. So when you don't have that perspective, you don't collect the data thinking on how we're going to use it. Because she felt the need for collecting this data because it was important. And I agree 100%, it's important. But then when we try to use it, we realize there are missing pieces. That's the thing. So I think there's a big effort, both from the government and from civil society, to fight the human trafficking. We have the tools. We need to fine-tune them. We need to improve collaboration and communication and make a standard for reporting, which is, by the way, a huge challenge. Because another problem that was mentioned to me is that some prosecutors avoid some of these terms because it creates a kind of a set of layers that they need to go through. So it's easier to conduct a prosecution using a different pattern, a different path, to reach the same result. The problem is now we cannot identify that information. Does that make sense? Okay, and the second question was?
Well, I mean, how much does gender play a
Oh,
role?
okay.
Even the prosecutors are probably male as well.
Okay, well, I don't have all the numbers. In the networks that we investigated, the pattern you mentioned is probably right. Now, I must say that I think we analyzed, how many reports did we analyze, Cesar?
I'm not sure, but I do have a little insight on the statistics. So human trafficking has two parts, sex and labor. If we combine both of them, we see that the disparity between gender is not as big as you might perceive. It comes to about 56 to 54% women compared to men, but that's just because labor is also taken into account. I'm not sure about how law enforcement, the gender between there and the relationship, but I do know that there's not such big disparity when it comes to actual victims.
Thanks a lot for the fantastic talk. I learned a lot. And me being a social scientist, I try to look at these people who are, whether they are running the human trafficking network or whatever it is, pimps or both their owners or roofing company owners or the kingpins or the network, whoever they are. Those people might not be particularly well educated. So they might not have this good understanding of the sophisticated network. You see the way that you presented here. So, but they are working in the network.
Right.
They are contributing to the kind of formation of network or development of the network. So I was wondering whether this kind of thing, let's say, police, FBI has adopted this kind of more sophisticated network to cripple the network, then it might be, in a way, overestimating the network or those people, like the way that, let's say, about 10, 20 years ago, we did terrorist networks. Back then, we kind of overestimated their financial power, their technological intelligence, or whatever we thought. I don't know. It just, if you look at the people there, it might be a bit overestimating.
Right, and to some extent, we can incorporate that into network design, right? So when we're talking just from a traditional supply chain network perspective, it happens the same with the truck driver or the other individuals who are operating in the facility, for example. With all the respect that truck drivers deserve from me, because actually I think they know very well what they do, right? But they know their operation, their own, right? So it's a niche type of knowledge. In the case of human trafficking, I think there are two different perspectives. One is those individuals who take part and they have a role in the supply chain, and they know only their isolated part of information, right? The assumption so far, from what I've heard, is that is how human trafficking networks work. Our hypothesis, the hypothesis of our group, is that yes and no, is that we can take some distance and look at the network from a more strategic perspective and trying to find the patterns, because there is communication. Even if they don't start, they don't have a contract. I agree with you. There's not a contract between the two of them that they go and they sign in front of a notary. It doesn't happen that way. But they do have these relationships. And these relationships essentially grow and create a network. So there was a case, fortunately, bringing South Korean women to California. So there was a network, a complete network of people in South Korea bringing them to California. Actually, I think it's one of the networks in the pictures that I show. And they had, if you think about it, they have the supplier, the transportation mode, the allocation of resources at the local level in California, and then not only that, they're smart enough to move the victims around, because they know if they are in one county and they go to prison, they get charges for prostitution or any other crime. As I said before, some of these victims, they have 15, 20 charges before, until the system realizes, you know what? Well, she's not doing this because she wants to do it. So my answer is like twofold. There is a small operation, but I think there might be a more strategic perspective we can take. And if we find that pattern, trust me, I'm gonna go and beg whoever's in charge of making decisions to listen to me.
Can you use the same technology that police use to basically like set up their traps? So police they basically map out like terrorist organizations, or like not like police in general, but they map out like where the most accidents occur, so they'll sit there like on like nights that people are more likely to drunk drive, like things like that, just to like map out the area, and like even just like parts of it could be prostitution, like they could be different levels of it, like.
Yes. So what you're referring to is descriptive and to some extent predictive analytics. Okay, so analytics, some people, it's a buzzword nowadays. It's all over the place. So descriptive is exactly what you said, mapping where these things are happening, right? You can just map the car accidents in a city and recognize that you need to invest $20,000 to a couple of traffic lights, right? So that is descriptive. Predictive is to say, well, if we invest this $20,000, we're going to decrease accidents by 15, 20, 30, 35%, whatever, right? So those are the 2 steps that we can take, right? Now, in those 2 steps, the main difficulty is the lack of data, the way we are communicating this data. So I agree with you 100%, but we need to understand that just trying to apply those 2 methodologies will fall short in terms of what you can accomplish. What we are proposing, it goes beyond descriptive and predictive. It's what we denominate prescriptive analytics. Prescription of something is taking steps so that the network does what we want it to do. So it's kind of creepy because it's how do I create incentives in a system so that the system moves into the direction that I want. So I'm not predicting what's going to happen. I'm not describing the situation. I'm going one step further. I'm saying if I increase prosecution in this sense, we're going to essentially start killing nodes and links so that quickly we destroy the network. So if we had infinite resources, we could do the same because we can put everyone in the country to find these people. We can pay $1,000 per day to every person in the United States to go after these individuals, and we're going to accomplish it. But we don't have the money. Right? Or maybe we do. But it's not the priority. Do you follow me? So that's the thing. If we can go one step further and do something that will modify the network, that goes beyond what we can do so far.
Yeah, one kind of interesting strategic question is whether the organizers of networks kind of intuitively know the difference between loosely coupled or tightly coupled systems.
Right.
And I don't know if you have any ideas about that, but that's quite an important.
That's a perfect question, and that's why they're very strategic on, for example, the ones that transport the victims. So that's a loose couple because that person doesn't know that he's taking part of organized crime. He doesn't know that he's a part of a human trafficking network. He's just doing what he's getting paid for, right? Might be an Uber or might be whatever. So when you attack those individuals, well, nothing happens to the network, right? So it is true. And one assumption that I don't want to make and I refuse to make it is like these individuals are stupid. When we make that assumption, we act like if they were fools and they're not going to respond to what we're doing. I want to assume that they're very smart, right? I mean, in a bad way, don't get me wrong. But they're smart in the sense that if we do something, they're going to react. They're going to try to protect their network. They're going to try to modify. And that's another complexity because these are networks that change. They're dynamics, right? It's like probably the best example is drug trafficking networks, right? They went from just, in your pocket or whatever to these pills that they take to submarines, to planes, right? So they evolve and they change technology and they actually innovate in a horrible way, but they do innovate, right? So so far we've been one step behind all the time with human trafficking, period. With all the respect that enforcement agencies, they have for enforcement agencies, the reality is that it seems from what I've learned so far is that we're always one step behind, right? We're only attacking the guys on the streets. We're not fighting the core, the root of the problem, and that's something that we want to propose. I think we still have time for a couple of questions. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for the good presentation. I've learned a lot about the supply chain network and also network modeling in this. So I'm Andre from Kenya, and in the year 2017, just after our elections, the current president nominated me to be in what we call advisory committee on counter trafficking in persons.
Okay.
And because of that, I've been able to interact with a number of people, including law enforcement from the USA.
Right.
But now I came back here as a PhD student, so I'm interested, probably I'll shoot you an email so that I can learn more.
You should come
about
and,
this and maybe even make
work
it
with us.
my
Yeah.
dissertation focus.
Yeah.
But what is interesting me is that I've been checking out the statistics that are online, and some of those that you indicated. And I remember sometimes early last year, I interacted with somebody from the US, I think equivalent of Attorney General from Washington, D.C.
Okay.
I can't remember her name offhand, but I can figure out later on. The kind of statistics that she gave us were a little bit higher than what I've been seeing online. So my question is it that the non-state actors and state actors in the US are not talking together? Because what we did through the advisory committee in Kenya was first of all to make sure that all the agencies within the government are there. And personally, I'm just representing the civil society so that we can take care of the issues of language, plus how to collect all these things and also to get data. So I believe from the state actors, they have more data, and that is why I was wondering why probably you decided to get more information from the lady who is doing human trafficking.org statistics. Is it more reliable than those from the state? Then the other question, final question is, in Kenya, you find that about 60% of human trafficking happens internally. About 40% or so are those that go abroad, and some of them end up coming here. And for those that happen internally, you find that most of the time, people are looking for people to work for them, for labor, maybe at home or maybe in the garden. And I don't know whether the network model, from your own experience, can be applied in such a scenario where we don't have one specific hub to coordinate so many of those, but probably individuals reaching out to poor people in rural or maybe slum areas. And if network model doesn't work, then what would you suggest to somebody like me?
Right. So, thank you for the comments. And regarding the first question, so data, everyone agrees that it's one, unreliable, right? There is lack of data, and we need more to gather more data. So I showed two different things. One was Polaris, and that's the project that is in charge of the human trafficking hotline, and they have reports. So reporting is one thing, prosecution is a different one. The next slide that I shown was from humantraffickingdata.org from Vanessa Boucher in Texas Christian University. She has a very rigorous process to essentially, I mean, it's quite remarkable because she checks the main databases for indictment reports, dockets, and I think news media as well. And she gathered that information with a set of steps. So she has students actually checking by hand, one by one. We're talking about thousands and thousands of cases, right? So it's a quite remarkable work. If you ask me, I think that data is more accurate than the other one because one is reports or what we can guess that is related to human trafficking. The other one is the output, is the result of a very rigorous process for data collection. And I mean, numbers are all over the place, to be honest, from millions to thousands, and depending on the country, it's actually really hard to estimate because it's a hidden network, right? It's a hidden activity. So it's an industry, it's a multi-billion industry, but by essence, it requires to be under the rug, right? And the second question was about applicability of networks in case of internal human trafficking. To some extent, network design models are flexible enough that you can define nodes and links depending on geographic distribution, relationships between people, I mean, you name it. If you go even to just scholar.google.com and you go network design, you're going to find thousands of papers, right? Because there's a lot written about how we can use network modeling in order to address different types of problems and challenges, right? So I cannot say 100% that we can take this model, adapt it, and voila, we have it. But I'm pretty confident that we can use this model at least to identify some key patterns in the network. Now, that is something that we're still refining, right? These models and the way they they attack the network, is to some extent is preliminary work, right? We're still developing mathematical optimization models to it, but it's flexible enough that we can adapt these models to different situations and realities, right? That's a key question. Every year I travel to Ghana. I spend 2 weeks in Maseofinso, in the center, very, very close to Kumasi. And I recognize there are cultural differences. And actually I didn't know, but in Ghana there's a big problem of human trafficking. There's a lot of migration. There's a lot of illegal labor, specifically in the gold industry. So I'm not aware of all the unique characteristics of Kenya, but I'm pretty sure that we can identify those situations and try to target. So the main thing is, how do we target our resources so we can create the most damage to the network, the most benefit to society? That's what it is. So thank you. Anything else? Any last question? Yes, no, maybe? Okay, thank you very much for